The Hearing, a legal podcast from Thomson Reuters.
Any person can step into the role of guardianship of nature if they want to. And any lawyer can do that as well. Any lawyer can say, well, okay, the current legal system says this, but I can do whatever I can within the current legal framework to protect trees, protect rivers, landscapes, wildlife, whatever it is. It doesn't always mean you'll be successful, but there's been many cases where I've stepped in and been able to save trees. And although that isn't strictly rights of nature because it hasn't been passed by Parliament, I was taking a rights of nature approach, a guardianship approach, in which I did whatever was in my professional power to save nature.
Hello and welcome to this episode of The Hearing by Thomson Reuters. I am your host, Becky Annison, and today I'll be exploring the rights of nature. Our lives and even businesses are inextricably linked with nature, yet this is reflected in a very piecemeal way in Western legal systems, often leading to actions and outcomes which damage both nature, humans and businesses. What would a more joined up way of thinking about nature and law look like? Today's guest and I will be looking at just that topic.
I'm Paul Powlesland, a barrister at Garden Court Chambers, co-founder of Lawyers for Nature and the guardian of the River Roding in London.
The Hearing.
Hello Paul, thank you so much for coming to talk to me today. I'm actually really excited to speak to you because I'm very familiar with your work at Lawyers for Nature and some of the other work you've done. But that's where I wanted to start this conversation. You founded Lawyers for Nature and you are absolutely working at the forefront of getting legal rights granted for nature. And I would love it if you could explain to our listeners what rights of nature is going to look like, and what are you hoping it's going to achieve?
Well, slightly annoyingly, we don't entirely know what rights of nature will look like yet, because in the course of drafting it, it's going to come into shape. But effectively, it starts from the very beginning, the relationship that humans have to nature, and changing that relationship, and then building legal, political, economic, social systems on top of that. And so rights of nature isn't really just one thing. It's an ecosystem of different, particularly legal interventions to change that underlying relationship we have with nature. So if you think of, as a human, all the different ways that your legal rights and relationships with other humans, with different systems are upheld, we need to reenact those for nature. The two broad types of rights of nature is the substantive rights, like they have in the Constitution of Ecuador, which gives substantive rights to nature, and then procedural rights, so legal personality and the right to be heard within human legal systems. Those are the two sort of broad types, but there's lots of other different aspects of rights of nature too, which we might go into in a bit as well. Fantastic.
Well, then I have to ask you, seeking to change the way the legal system works in this way, absolutely fascinating. But what motivates you to move into this type of legal work?
I mean, for me, it's an underlying deep love and care for nature and wanting to bring that into my legal work. I first got involved in rights of nature because I started doing cases to try and save trees from unnecessary destruction, and realised that our legal system is not very protective of trees at all. Many of them don't have proper legal protection. And that actually one of the main reasons for that was that the laws that we do have protecting trees are ultimately there largely for human needs. They're there for tree preservation orders are for human amenity. And I started looking around being like, are there other systems that are trying to look at this in a more systemic level, not just overlaying laws onto a broken foundation? And came across the rights of nature movement, which is very much spreading around the world over the last 2 decades, particularly in countries with a strong indigenous presence, fundamentally because indigenous peoples have largely not forgotten the ultimate truth that nature is alive, that nature is more than a resource to be used for human ends, and that nature has its own interests which need to be upheld and represented in our human legal system.
So speaking of human systems, I think it's fair to say that we're currently living in some interesting political times. And I really want to talk to you about where you think we are currently standing in relation to establishing those rights of nature, given the political times that we're currently living through. I read an article that The Guardian, some time ago now, was claiming that 2024 could be the year that rights of nature entered the mainstream. We're halfway through 2025 now. What's the current prognosis on that from your perspective?
I don't think we can look at rights of nature as one thing that will get a magic law passed and it'll all be solved. It is literally the work of a lifetime, and it won't be completed in my lifetime, I'm pretty sure. I've often said, and I think it's true, that rights of nature will be to the 21st century what human rights were to the 20th. But again, we know with that there wasn't one moment, that there were key milestones in the enactment of human rights. But it took decades, most of the century, and it's still not complete in many ways, as we know. So we need to look at it in that way. I think rights of nature has gone mainstream in terms of people's knowledge of it, definitely. A lot more people are aware of it. What was a very fringe idea just 10, 15 years ago is now known by a lot of people. There are increasing numbers of enactments around the world where it's becoming a legal reality. In 2022, the Supreme Court of Ecuador protected the Los Cedros forest on the basis that it has a right to exist as derived from the Constitution. So there is a cloud forest that has been awarded its rights. There is a river in New Zealand that has legal personality, guardianship, and self-ownership. That's the Wanganui River. These things are a reality, increasingly so around the world. Also, the Mar Menor in Europe now has guardianship body and rights, the first real rights of nature intervention in Europe. So we know it can be done in non-Indigenous countries without an Indigenous presence. The UK and to some extent the US are harder nuts to crack because we do really love expropriating nature, and the political situation is more difficult. And that's why, in addition to these long-term goals of constitutional changes and passing new laws and statutes and acts of parliament and that kind of thing, I and many other rights of nature activists also look at the really more detailed minutiae that people can do right away. And the truth is that any person can step into the role of guardianship of nature if they want to. And any lawyer can do that as well. Any lawyer can say, well, okay, the current legal system says this, but I can do whatever I can within the current legal framework to protect trees, protect rivers, landscapes, wildlife, whatever it is. Doesn't always mean you'll be successful, but there's been many cases where I've stepped in and been able to save trees. And although that isn't strictly rights of nature because it hasn't been passed by Parliament, I was taking a rights of nature approach, a guardianship approach, in which I did whatever I could, whatever was in my professional power to save trees, save nature.
Well, honestly, that sounds absolutely fascinating, actually. If we could explore that a bit more, I'd be really grateful, because I'm an ex-lawyer, sort of. I still work in an adjacent field, but I'm not a practicing solicitor anymore. And when I was a practicing solicitor, I was commercial contract solicitor, so not somebody who would be appearing in front of a judge to argue a case. So I would love to hear from you. What are the sorts of things who the lawyers listening to this podcast, some of whom might be barristers, but some of whom could be solicitors, what are the sorts of things that they can do in their professional lives to enact the guardianship that you're talking about?
Well, I mean, I really want to emphasize that because the human's impingement upon nature is so vast, almost whatever area of law you're in, you would be able to do something to help protect nature, whether it's insurance or commercial law, criminal law, civil, whatever it is, there will be something you can do that would help protect nature. And I know all around the UK, there are so many nature protection campaigns that are desperate for legal advice and assistance. But it's more the approach that's important, which is using your skills in whatever way you can to peacefully protect nature. Now, I'll maybe give an example as to how this works. I was contacted by a local group in a place called Wellingborough in the UK who were trying to save an avenue of lime trees from destruction. And I got an email from them and read it late at night on a Sunday, and I was going to ignore it and be like, I've got to go to bed. But I started reading the email, first mistake, and realised that they were legally correct. These trees had tree preservation orders on them. It would be a criminal offence to fell them. So I stayed up till the early hours of the morning, wrote them an advice, sent it off to them, and expected that to work. And then next day saw on social media not only the trees being felled, but people being arrested for trying to stop the trees being felled. So the police were arresting people trying to stop a criminal offence happening. Absolutely outrageous. So then I went down to Wellingborough myself the next day. Luckily, my case had settled, so I travelled there and went to the officer in charge and had a copy of my advice, explained it to him, took him through it. Any questions, any bits you're unsure about? And he said, we're not here to take sides. And then 10 minutes later started marching towards everyone and read out a pre-prepared speech saying that he would arrest anyone standing underneath the trees so they could be felled. Even though my advice clearly stated, and he hadn't disagreed with any of it, that would be illegal. So in that moment, I had a choice. I could either just move away and let the trees be felled. I didn't have time to go and get an injunction. They were literally about to be felled there and then. Could have then maybe won a case 6 months later to prove that my advice was right, but the trees would be gone and you can't bring them back. So I decided to do the only thing I could do, which was to climb the tree. So I climbed the tree and occupied it for an entire day, and then crucially went on social media and wrote a whole thread about why I'd occupied the tree, screenshotted my advice with the permission of the clients, put it up on Twitter. Again, if anyone disagrees with my legal advice here, let me know. And it went viral around the world and caused the local council's social media to melt down, the local police's social media to melt down. And after 8 or 9 freezing hours up a tree, they agreed that if I came down, they would spare the trees that week and have a meeting with the tree protesters. That week sparing then led into a campaign to raise £60,000 to take a judicial review, went before the High Court, and the High Court concluded my advice was right and the trees shouldn't be felled, and they're still existing now. But that to me really illustrates the essence of being a lawyer for nature. It is not being part of one area of law. I'm not an environmental lawyer. I will use whatever legal tools and campaigning tools and mechanisms, peaceful, always peaceful, but whatever campaigning tools, mechanisms that I can to protect the nature that I love. And that is what I think more lawyers should step into. And there's one more example I want to give actually, which is in terms of a moral shift, there haven't been this many moral shifts of this magnitude in our society of bringing nature into the class of rights holders, of legal rights holders. It's probably slavery is one of the key ones there, where before we morally said that slaves had no standing in our system, they had no rights in our system. We had laws about slaves, of course. You couldn't kill another person's slave in the same way as you couldn't cut another person's tree down, but we didn't have laws for slaves. And obviously that there were ways that lawyers were involved in that. They brought cases to try and challenge things around the edge, Somerset and Morn, where they tried to, and the slave ship Zong case, I believe was a case about insurance, to try and chip away at the edges of slavery and bring attention to the campaign. But there was one lawyer who was most involved in it called James Stephen, and he was an associate of William Wilberforce. And Wilberforce had presented the same anti-slavery bill to the House of Commons every year throughout the 1790s and early 1800s. Every year it had failed due to the commercial opposition of the slavers. And then in 1806, this lawyer called James Stephen caught William Wilberforce about to go and present another bill and said, "Don't present that bill, I've got a better one." And he was a commercial lawyer, one of the best commercial lawyers of his day, and he knew that many of the ships that were conducting the slave trade, that they were being falsely flagged to avoid being flagged as French ships, which Britain was at war at. So he presented a bill that didn't mention slavery at all, just said that we want to ban foreign flag ships that could be assisting our enemies, sold it as a patriotic measure. Wilberforce didn't even speak in relation to it, and it passed. And that decimated the slave trade and led towards the abolition of the slave trade in 1807. And I tell that story because James Stevens was a commercial lawyer. And I wonder who, listening to this, for instance, someone who doesn't consider themselves an environmental lawyer can strike the same blow in their area for nature. What little clever quirk of insurance law or banking law, commercial law, could be used to protect nature? And no doubt a clever insurance lawyer who comes up with the right tweak could do way more for nature than I'll ever achieve in my lifetime by, for instance, being able to withdraw insurance from those committing deforestation or something like that. So I really want to get people away from the idea that just only environmental lawyers can make a difference. No, this goes to everyone. And I struggle to think of a lawyer or a subject area that couldn't have some impact for nature if they wanted to.
I absolutely love that. The lawyer in me appreciates the finessing that was done there and the clever thinking.
Quite beautiful, huh? And this
very
is where,
beautiful.
And in these topics, in these big moral topics, it's not just about passing one law. It's somewhere between politics, campaigning, activism, law, spirituality. All of these things kind of come into a meld, I think.
Well, I'm going to ask you another question now, which goes to that meld, and which actually I think speaks to the lime trees that you were mentioning earlier. Some time ago, I interviewed the CEO of Surfers Against Sewage. He's a lovely gentleman, also an ex-lawyer. He was concerned that laws weren't the issue in relation to water. He was saying that we have all the water protection regulations that we need. We have a surfeit of them. The problem is they're not being enforced. And that made me think, in the context of rights of nature, what does enforcement of that look like? What are the enforcement issues that you might see? Because as we've seen with water, it's one thing to have a law. It's quite another to make sure that that law gets followed. And the reason I think it's relevant to your lime tree case there is, of course, the law was on the side of the trees and very nearly didn't protect them.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, this goes back to what I said right at the start about the two broad types of rights of nature intervention: substantive rights versus procedural. And I wouldn't entirely agree we have all the substantive rights we need. We have quite a few for water, actually, more than trees. Rivers have a number of laws protecting them. They often don't cover things like road runoff, which is actually probably as serious as sewage, maybe more so. But yeah, we have laws, for instance, around sewage, which are roundly ignored. And this is where legal personhood comes in, procedural rights of nature. Because at the moment, rivers can't bring legal cases, or guardians for rivers can't bring legal cases in the name of the river. And it obviously seems a bit mad at first to say that, a river or a tree should be able to bring a legal case. How could a river appear in court? How could a tree appear in court?
Well, you say that, but is it any more wild than saying a corporate entity has a legal personhood?
Yes, I mean
how can a corporation stand in court?
Exactly. You're getting ahead of my example there. This is all I always
so
say.
Sorry.
And it's truly a testament to the imagination of common law lawyers that we managed to give legal personality to entirely fictitious entities before we gave them to real existing trees, rivers, wildlife that actually exists, and not only exist, but which we ultimately rely on for our own existence as humans. So yeah, to me, it isn't any crazier to give legal personality to a river. I actually am the guardian of a river in East London called the Roding, where I live, which I care for the river. And I could pretty easily set out what it would practically look like for the River Roding to have legal personality. And the crucial thing is, as well, as I said earlier, it's already a reality in a common law jurisdiction. So New Zealand, very typical common law jurisdiction, they have a river called the Wanganui, which has legal personality, a guardianship body, and self-ownership. And that was just done by passing an act of their parliament in 2017, and it seems to practically work. So this isn't beyond the realms of legal imagination. It's purely, largely an issue of politics and practicality, because in New Zealand they have an indigenous presence, the Maori people, who demanded that their sacred river, the Wanganui, be given legal personality and transferred into self-ownership rather than being purely owned by the British Crown. But what practical difference would this make? Well, I often give an example of thinking of a company, so go into this corporate thing and say, what if we had a company like Tesco or Walmart, and we kept all the substantive legal provisions the same? So the law of theft and trespass and criminal damage, they'd all be the same, but we just strip Tesco or Walmart or whoever of legal personality. What would happen to those companies? They would go bankrupt. Everyone would roundly abuse their rights, steal from them, damage them, just completely abuse any legal rights they have, because there'd be no enforcement. And even if we said, oh well, we won't entirely get rid of enforcement, we'll set up a companies agency, a government agency, which can bring legal cases on behalf of companies, but we'll underfund it so they only bring cases 5% of the time. What would happen to those companies? They'd be bankrupt. And that's equivalent to the situation in the UK we have, where the river itself can't bring an action, but the Environment Agency can bring one on the river's behalf. They haven't brought any on my river in the last couple of decades, even though there have been hundreds of serious criminal offences committed against the river. Criminal offence committed against the river, and they've done nothing. And thus the river is being damaged, despite all these laws that said it shouldn't. And I've been walking along my river and finding completely illegal sewage spills happening. Torrents of raw sewage coming into the river that's illegal, and no one's doing anything. And it would be fundamentally different if there was a guardianship body for the river roading, and that guardianship body would have brought legal cases by now, injunctions saying, no, this is criminal, this needs to be fixed within a certain time scale, or we're going to get damages, we'll private prosecute you, whatever it may be. And yeah, you can see that on trees as well. With they need guardians, and a lot of the time, ordinary people are stepping into this role. So it's not ideal, but in a haphazard way. For instance, I'm stepping into the role where there probably should be proper guardians of the roading. I'm stepping into that role. The people of Wellingborough stepped into that role for their trees, but it probably shouldn't be down to ordinary people having to crowdfund money, doing raffles and things to ensure that the law is upheld in relation to nature. And for me, the fact that the law is so routinely broken with nature shows that fundamental flaw we have in not according legal personality to nature.
The Hearing.
On the outside, you're a lawyer, calm and cool, but inside there's a passion to perform, a drive to be absolutely on your game. You prepare hour after hour, day after day in the pursuit of excellence, relying on superior resources, serious preparation, and total confidence. That's the advantage we give you. Be your best with Thomson Reuters Practical Law.
As allegiances are tested
You're gambling with World War III.
and regimes fall,
Fighters and civilians continue to stream in from other parts of Syria.
no matter where the story is, Reuters World News podcast is there. We make sense of the news shaping our world and give you everything you need to know in a 10-minute podcast every weekday. I'm your host, Kim Vanell. Listen and follow wherever you get your podcasts.
So then let's take the current situation and explore it a bit further. What do you think will ultimately happen if we don't manage to secure and, let's say, enforce successfully, since they go hand in hand, if we don't secure and enforce rights of nature?
We will continue to see the destruction and degradation of the natural world. At first, that manifests merely that will manifest in it being a uglier, nastier, more horrible world for us to live in. But as we keep going down that path, which it appears we're going to, we will also ruin our own survivability as a species. In many ways, I believe that all of the environmental crises that we see are ultimately manifestations of this one great relational issue, which is that humans see themselves as separate from nature. Nature as a dead resource to be extracted from and dumped into with no interests of its own and completely unsacred, if you want to say it that way. And I believe that all the crises, so the climate crisis, the ocean crisis, the plastics crisis, the sewage crisis, all of these, obviously the climate crisis being the most serious manifestation, but one manifestation are manifestations of that. And we know what's going to happen if we don't either arrest or solve those crises. We're going to destroy our own civilization and many of our own lives. And I also don't believe that we can truly solve these without solving the underlying relational issue. And the problem is, if we try and put sticking plasters on a broken system. For instance, in trying to solve the climate crisis as purely a carbon problem, we not only ignore the biodiversity crisis, the degradation of nature, we may well make it worse by trying to provide energy in a zero carbon way that then impinges upon nature. Solar panels, wind turbines, all the mining and everything that goes with those. So I do see it as a very dark path if we don't change this. But equally, I don't want people to get pessimistic and think that if we don't achieve full rights of nature in the next decade, that we've somehow failed. Every river that is cared for and whose health improves is a win. Every tree that is saved is a win. Every ecosystem that is made richer is a win. And every single person, lawyer or non-lawyer, can contribute to that and protect and restore and increase the richness and vitality of nature. It's within all of our powers. And I think for me, probably the most proud work of my life by far is the trees I've been able to save. And when I go back and visit them, it's just the most beautiful feeling to put your hand on a tree and gaze up at something so beautiful and know that you helped to save it and that it would be a pile of logs had you not done something. Or to look at a tree that you planted as a tiny little sapling and see it towering over you like a proud tree parent.
I love that. Well, before we end, I like to ask this question of my guests. You're the expert in this area. You've said many wonderful and incredibly interesting things, but what is the question that you wish I had asked you that I didn't?
I've sort of alluded to it a number of times, but I do think there's something very important about how are Lawyers for Nature and other rights of nature campaigners and activists making rights of nature a reality. And now I have to answer that.
I'm afraid that you do, yes.
Well, because it's a multifaceted problem, we're Lawyers for Nature are sort of attacking it from lots of different angles, I suppose. So I mentioned this sort of broken underlying relationship and how we don't even perceive ourselves as part of nature anymore. So Lawyers for Nature join with other organisations to get the dictionary to change the definition of nature, which previously excluded humans, and to include humans once again, which they did tweak the definition to bring back an old definition of nature. We are also seeking to make representation of nature a reality already. So Lawyers for Nature did a project called still doing it, called Nature on the Board, where we appointed a nature director of a company for the first time to represent nature's interests in their decision making. And that company was called Faith in Nature. And they appointed their nature director a couple of years ago now. And other companies are now following suit. A company called House of Hackney, which does interior design, and a number of others are in the pipeline to start appointing that. And we're also extending that to charities and third sector organisations to have nature trustees legally constituted within their governing bodies and governance, so that nature can be represented in the decision making of charities. Also looking at land ownership is a big issue, ultimately in the same way that slave owners had a very big influence upon the slaves that they own, landowners have a very big influence upon the land that they own. And they can treat their land well or treat it badly. And the law at the moment only intervenes in the very worst cases, and even then does very little about damage to land from landowners. In other words, landowners can do loads of things, which if anyone else did it to their land would be criminal damage. But when they do it to their land, it's A-OK, which I find very interesting. Obviously, changing the entire basis of land ownership in the UK is going to be very difficult. Parliament's probably not going to pass that act anytime soon, but there's a huge possibility for voluntary action. That is, more enlightened landowners emancipating their own land, giving it self-ownership. And we're investigating ways that they can do that. Or if not self-ownership, can they legally entrench certain rights and interests that the land might have through conservation covenants, for instance. And there are very likely hundreds of thousands of acres of land in the UK where the landowner, I think, would be, and the thousands of landowners who would be potentially open to this voluntary idea of including a rights of nature approach in their ownership. We're also carrying on supporting activists where we can who are trying to save their local nature, and also crucially doing that in a way that provides case studies and examples. The Wellingborough thing, obviously save the trees in Wellingborough, but as well as doing that, it tells a nice story about, well, firstly, what a lawyer can do to help protect nature, but also why our current tree protections are inadequate, and why our current attitudes towards nature are inadequate. And we keep finding these case studies to hold up a mirror to the current system and say why rights of nature is needed. And similarly on the roading, the work I do as a river guardian there, it's actively helping the river roading, but as well as that, it's providing unbelievable amounts of examples and case studies of the failure of our current legal system to protect nature. So if someone says to me, well, why do we need rights of nature? We've got environmental law and we've got the Environment Agency. I mean, God help them, because I will just throw a dozen examples of where the Environment Agency and the current environmental law has completely failed to protect my river, and where grossly destructive and illegal activities have been just purely allowed. And finally, supporting people around the UK who want to be nature guardians, and also to start formulating and declaring rights of nature. So earlier this year, the River Ouse became the first river in the UK to be recognised by a local council as having rights. And other rivers are now following suit, and Lawyers for Nature is helping those rivers to draft up what their rights should be and find interesting mechanisms to try and bring those in. But even if there's no legal mechanism, giving local groups ways to declare the rights as if they exist. Obviously, that has no legal effect per se, but then to begin making those rights a reality with whatever tools they have. That's just some of the stuff. And hopefully as well, in addition to that, we're drafting a Rights of Nature bill, not necessarily in the hope that it's going to be passed anytime soon, but just so at least when people say, well, what would this look like practically, we've got that. Also, ethical guidance for those who are representing nature. So there are increasing numbers of voices of nature being appointed to different bodies, as we mentioned with the Faith in Nature Director example. So producing guidance, what does it actually look like to be a voice of nature, and how do we avoid people pretending they're representing nature but actually representing themselves? And then finally bring it back to the roading. I persuaded them, the Catchment Partnership, to become the first Catchment Partnership to appoint a voice of the river in England the first Catchment Partnership in England to appoint a voice of the river to the Catchment Partnership. So I've been drafting the rights that person would uphold and the governance of that. Lots of different and exciting ways. And I hope people listening who might have been inspired by this will think of ways that in their legal practice or in whatever area they're in, that they might find ways to begin to change the way that our systems relate to nature and bring in rights of restoration and protection and forms of legal representation and personhood in whatever way they can.
That's brilliant. It's an excellent answer to the question you posed yourself there, Paul. No,
I gave the longest answer to my own question. I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing, but there was quite a few bits I needed to mention there, so I sort of shoehorned them all in.
No, I think it's brilliant. Well, thank you so much.
The Hearing.
It is no secret that the legal nerd in me gets very excited when lawyers come up with creative ways to use existing systems to do good in the world. I want lawyers to use the tools they have and feel empowered in this way, but Paul proposes something deeper, not a patchwork of laws, not really even rights of nature, but a total rewiring of our culture and how we think about nature and our relationship with it. And that's the most exciting thing of all. Thank you so much to Paul for discussing this with me, and thank you all for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, then please do like and subscribe for more content. And if you want to comment on anything you've heard today, then email us at thehearing@thomsonreuters.com. I've been Becky Annison. Goodbye.
The Hearing. a legal podcast from Thomson Reuters. To find out more, go to tr.com/The Hearing or subscribe via iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts.